Welcome back to Greece, where I am soaking up as much vitamin D as I can get my hands on. Now, I've brought us to a building. It is the very top of the rock that the village the van is in sits on. And I brought us here for a few reasons. One, because I just think it's a really cool place. I always thought it would make an amazing boutique car show or festival, a hotel, or it was supposed to be the civic centre for the village, and I guess that the funds were misappropriated. And I would say to buy this building now as it is, you would still have to cut through more red tape than a guy working on 70s car wiring. But just all of these vaults and pillars and Escher-esque unfinished stairwells and stuff, which just reminds me of Labyrinth. I love this place, very, very cool, and you can drive into it. Anyway, this is where I had the van stored. It was stashed here for a couple of years while I was on Grand Tour, and this is where it got its kicking. This is where things started to decline. But from here, looking down the coast, there's another hour of these twisty roads that runs up over the water on the side of the mountain, and the same going north. The drive here is incredible, and one of these days I will get the camera rig here and a car that is capable of having some fun on these bits of roads, and I will do it with, we'll do it together. Every once in a while though, usually on a Sunday, you get a little bit of this. It'd give you the itch, wouldn't it? Now, we're not going to see a lot of the van in this episode because I just haven't gotten to work on it yet. But what has happened is VW Heritage, the parts centre in the UK, has sent me a huge box, and in it is every panel that I need to finish the bus, which is just incredible. And I have to say thanks to Andy at VW Heritage for sending me the parts. Very much looking forward to getting stuck in. Now, later on in the episode, we will talk to a man called Richard, who is an engine designer, has worked for Lotus and currently works for Jaguar Land Rover, and who asked me in the interim between this episode and last, why didn't that interview at Eden Harbin make you run screaming from the Esprit? Well, it turns out in his interview he answered that question. We will get to it, but first we need to do a little bit of work on Tina. It was the day I was bringing Tina home for the first time. I wasn't even halfway across the country, and I looked into the passenger footwell, and the trim was hanging down underneath the glove box, and I could see wiring, and I thought, great, already there's something that I'm going to get the blame for. But Rob knew about it. It was just the clips had gone missing, never been replaced, and every once in a while it drops. Now, the backing of the trim had been ripped, so the first thing I did was tease off the black front section, and using some upholstery adhesive and some felt, I just wrapped some new material around it, and I just used a soldering iron to sear a nice clean hole through them. I kind of wish I'd cut them a bit more neatly. Anyway, this is invisible stuff. Now the clips, I just couldn't find them. I couldn't find the exact ones. I could find things very like the spring end of it. I couldn't find any with the same head. So I thought to myself, well, why would you go and buy something that will do the job perfectly when you can just make something that won't be as nice? So what you're looking at here is a piece of standard stainless steel welding filler wire. This you'll get from any welding supply place. And I'm doing it in the vise here just because it looks kind of cool, but I didn't do it in the vise. I did it with a needle nose pliers. So here it is in more kind of real time or real time-ish. And I'm just forming the bends in this and using the original clip and ones I made subsequently for reference as I went. These don't all need to be exactly the same size and shape. Once they're the right size to go through the piece of trim and then through the hole in the dashboard of the car where they're located, then they're going to work great. And the upshot of making my own is I can make this nice big wide flange on them that has a bit of spring to it, so it'll grip very, very nicely. These clips do exactly the same thing, arguably do more than the original clip because, like I say, they've got that wider flange on them. Here they are. I made 3. I actually only needed 2, but I was just on a bit of a roll. So back in the car, in they went, and they're great. You know, if you look from down at this angle, you can see them, obviously, but from every other angle, they're completely invisible. And it's not a big deal. But the peace of mind you get knowing that your trim isn't going to fall down when there are people in the car, you know, that makes it look like this old classic banger. It can't be beaten. Now, there's one other job we're going to tackle on the Cortina. Last episode I mentioned that I'd already tackled the fuel filter in the fuel pump. Well, the pump has a kind of a bell housing, a kind of a cap on the outside of it, and there's just a really simple gauze filter inside this cap. And I was excited about doing this because I thought this is going to be so gunked up, full of crud, and it'll make such a big difference for such a small amount of work to the running of the car. No, it was almost spotless inside, which is very impressive, but not so good for my mechanicking fix. So anyway, while we have it off, we might as well clean it up and make sure it is perfect. So we can see inside here, if I turn it around into the light, you can see there is a little bit of crud inside it, and there is just some grains of dirt on the gauze itself. If I hold it into the light, you'll see it better. This is just a very, very fine gauze, really, really cool. And this grit is obviously just little bits of fuel tank and dirt that comes in with the fuel. So I filled up a jar with some neat petrol or gasoline, depending on where you're sniffing it. And then I realized, well, this thing's bathed in gasoline, so it's not just going to fall off itself. So I gave it some help with a very small screwdriver and very gently get the big bit. Get the big bit. A quick rinse of the bell housing itself. This sounds good. Okay, if you look in the jar now, you can see there actually was quite a bit of stuff trapped on the filter. You can see it here. And like I said, this was never going to affect the running of the car. If it was caught in the filter was doing its job, and it wasn't enough to stop the fuel flow. Now, onto the cap itself. The fibre washer was absolutely destroyed, so we'll replace that in a second. And I thought, hey, can't very well in good conscience put this back on the car without giving it a good wire brush and maybe a lick of paint. So I did that. And then I realised that the only paint I had in the shed was VHT silver, and the nozzle wasn't even working, so I had to kind of brush this on. So it's not a very good job, and if you were paying attention in the last episode, you probably noticed it's already a bit rusty. I'll have to go back to it. Anyway, with the new fibre washer in and the cap back on, this is a done deal. When I get back to Ireland and the Cortina, I will get straight into the rust work and we'll eliminate that as best we can. No Vogue this time, just so that we can get all of Richard's interview in, because I think it's very interesting. I can't skip the sheet metal break though. I'm just too excited about tarting it up. Alright, super happy, fun fabrication time. Now before we start to make the top jaw of this, the clamping jaw, let's go back and look at the machine that we took reference from. Now, even though this thing is stacked, it is so heavily built, it is still braced here at the front. That's what these bars are. And there was an 8-foot massive press on this same shop floor, and it had these same brace bars, because the forces that even a 1mm sheet of steel will put on these clamping jaws are substantial. And we might have to use bars like this on this design that we're making, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The first thing we're going to do to reinforce the clamping jaw is we're going to take the 60mm piece of angle iron and we're going to weld it to the back of the 80mm. Now look at this. This is the movement in the piece. When I was welding it, this is warping. But when I turned it over to do the bottom half, it seems to have cancelled itself out. You can see this movement here. Whatever happened, the jaw seems to be sitting flat. Now maybe the rest of the bed is warped too and it's all complementing each other, but I don't think so. So I ground that back, and I learned a lot about welding when I was doing this, because I realized, you know, too much filler wire, too slow a weld, and you build it up too high and you're grinding for hours, and obviously too little and it's weak. So there is a kind of a practice attained sweet spot. If you haven't bitten the bullet yet and started just to mess around with a welder, even a cheap one, just do it. It will stand to you. Now, I've reinforced the back with the 60mm, but the lip of this jaw, the front edge that will actually be right in the center of the fold, that isn't braced, and that could easily still flex. So I decided, I haven't seen this anywhere else, but I made up some triangular gussets. Now I'm not going to weld these in this time, for the simple reason that I ran out of time. They're not quite perfect. You can see they're not quite sitting exactly right, which isn't a big deal, but I just didn't want to rush. These are about a foot apart. I figured they're going to stiffen it up substantially. Maybe it'll be enough, maybe it won't. But we'll see when we have this thing fully operational. Now I want to elaborate a bit on what I was saying about making this thing a little bit pretty. I'd love to make it so it looked like it had a bit of age to it, and that it was built in a time when things were still pretty. You know, there was still a little bit of design put into them rather than making them purely functional. So do you remember the 120mm angle iron that we got? It's 12mm thick, and I cut it down on one side. Now I got the measurement slightly wrong, that's why it's sitting a little short here, but we can make up for that, there's no problem there. Back to the reference machine again, and I was really happy to find that it's built kind of the same way, but you see the springs here, these are to lift the clamping jaw up. When you pull the lever, they are what lift the clamping jaw up to release your workpiece. Well, our belt tensioners from the Astra, we'll scavenge the springs from those and we'll use them there. They will go underneath the 120mm, which will be welded to the end of the clamping jaw. There'll be a threaded bar going up through those springs from the bed, and on top of that we'll have a bolt so we can tighten the whole thing down. Are you with me? Now, here's the pretty bit. I wanted to find some really big oversized wing nuts. I wanted to be able to just reach over and twist a massive wing nut and clamp this down. But who makes wing nuts in brass? I just had this idea in my head that brass would look lovely against this kind of untreated steel. And then I had a brainwave and I made a little order, and this is what I got. Now I'd love to see if you can guess what these are, but these are going to be our first foray into brazing, which I think must be one of the most beautiful ways of kind of joining two pieces of metal. We are going to learn to braze when we braze some nuts into these brass fittings to make our own oversized wing nuts. But that's for another day. Oh, the other thing is I've got some piano frames, and I'll talk to you about how I've got those another time, but these piano frames I fancied would make a great stand for this whole machine. They're all a slightly different shape and size, but if we can get them to talk to each other, then maybe we can make a very cool cast iron stand for this brake. Anyway, if you think you know what those wing nuts are, don't be shy. Two little bits of business. The Sergeant Angry commented on episode 17 to say that the first production mid-engine car was actually the Bonnet Jet, or the Matra Jet, in 1962. That's 4 years before the Miura. So thanks a million for keeping the hoe in check, mate. Don't hesitate in future. Very cool intel. The second thing is, there was such a big response and kind of deluge of people sending me photos of their cars, which I love seeing, that I can't fit them all in this time, but I will. So if you're not in this round, I'll get to you, don't worry. The first person is Kieran O'Sullivan. He's a patron, and a few months ago he had said, just by the by on the community page, that he was looking for a kind of a late 70s Honda 250, small cc Honda motorcycle, and he got one. Now he hasn't sent me a pre-photograph, but I know he only spent a couple of hundred on this thing, and my God, there must have been some hard work in the interim because it looks really good, pal. Thanks a million for the photo. Send us some photos of your Mini. He has a Mini too, and we'd love to see that. The next person is Jim Freeman, and Jim has a 911, a Porsche called Petra, and it was her 30th birthday recently enough, and I think what he did was hilarious. Have a look at this. That's gotta be love, right? It has to be. I'm gonna link the rest of that video in the description. Sean Kane is a man who lives in the United Arab Emirates, but is from very close to where I live in Ireland. And over the years, he has had so many Lotuses. I asked him flat out, are you a stealer, pal? This is really smacks of like an inventory from a Lotus dealer. But no, he assures me these were all privately owned over the years, and he does all his own work. That kind of sparked more than a little bit of jealousy in me. Thanks a million for the photos. Really some incredible collection there. The person I want to send the kit to though is Michael Nichols in Perth, Australia. He has a 1985 Honda City Turbo. It's a car that I vaguely kind of knew existed, but what I didn't know was Honda had made a one-make racing series version of this car, a wide-bodied version, and knowing that he wasn't going to be able to get himself one of those, Michael decided to build his own body for it. And so he did. He used composites and moulding foam, and he's just done it. And it's not sprayed yet, but it is one hell of a job. I'm going to link in the description to his pages. There is so much more to this story, and I can't wait to see this thing done, pal. I hope you can get it sprayed really soon for your own pleasure, and I'm going to send you this kit and you can use it on the car whenever it's done. Okay, it is time for the interview with Richard. Richard was a guy who came onto the Patreon page and he said, look, I hear you're coming to the UK, there's a bed here for you, and furthermore, LotusXL.net is something I'm a member of, and we have a stand at the NEC at the Classic Car Show. There is a pass for you if you want to come and use it and stay the night. So I did. And the guys were brilliant. And their stand was something out of the ordinary, I think, at the show, because Richard didn't even wash his car. He had just rebuilt the engine, and he took the bonnet off. It was pride of place on the stand amongst some stunning cars from the members of LotusXL.net, but it looked a bit shabby and the bonnet was off, and so there was a constant stream of people attracted to it, and there was a constant stream of guys working on it trying to diagnose a non-running problem. And I just thought that was great. Amongst all that hardware and $1 million cars and everything was Richard's XL, and it was gaining probably more consistent kind of attention than a lot of the other stuff. Anyway, the guys at LotusXL.net were fantastic. I gotta say a shout out to them and a thanks to Richard. His interview was just so interesting, and I think it goes a long way to showing you what I think about Lotus, and you know why nothing will put me off the Esprit. Here it is. Okay, so
yeah, so I'm Richard Gosling, and I drive a Lotus XL, which I've had for 5 years or so now. I've spent most of the last year rebuilding the engine of that in my kitchen, because I've got a fantastic wife who's put up with that nonsense. And outside of that, I work for Jaguar Land Rover. I'm an engine designer, and many years back I worked for Lotus as an engine designer as well.
Just by the by.
Yeah. So I've got the connection to Lotus, and when I was wanting to buy an interesting car, obviously having worked for the company, it was something I was going to be drawn towards.
So what do you do in Jaguar Land Rover?
I work in engine design. My particular field is stress analysis. So somebody will design a component, whether it's going to be an engine mount, a sump, a bracket that holds the power steering pump on or something, and it's my job to work out what the loads on that component are going to be. I build very detailed computer models of these components, apply the loads of them, and work out whether it's up to the job or not.
There's this common perception that there's built-in obsolescence.
No. Really, quite the opposite. Is we don't want stuff to go wrong, because it's bad for the company's reputation. I would say in the past, generally it was a case of you did the analysis and you made sure something was up to the job, it was strong enough, and that would be enough. Now, because for a number of reasons, there's a much bigger push to create the optimum design. So it may pass, but if it passes by too big a margin, you're going to say, okay, there's some spare material there, I can cut that out, I can reduce the amount of material in this. It will make the component lighter, it will make the vehicle lighter, it will make the vehicle faster and better and more economical. The old Colin Chapman mantra of adding lightness. And so if and when we have the opportunity, we do try and make these components as good as they can be, rather than just saying it's strong enough and that will do. But the components I'm working with tend to be the big structural things. They're things like conrods, engine mounts, brackets. These aren't the components that would break during planned obsolescence anyway. I'm not quite sure what the bits that would, but it's the bits that are going to wear out that you know there might be the push to try and say, well, let's push that a bit closer. I don't think that goes on with anything I work on, but who knows what's happened with other companies in the past. Certainly, you know, when you design something, it has a design life. All engines say, you know, when they're setting out to design an engine, you're going to say, I need this engine to design to last, maybe sort of in the 70s or 80s, they'd have said 100,000 miles. Now it's going to be, I honestly wouldn't know, but you're going to be like sort of 400,000 or 500,000 miles. Back in the 50s and 60s, it was probably only 50,000 miles. And you would design a component to last that long or no longer.
I'm not being funny here, did I touch a nerve there? Is that something
No.
that you get?
No, it's actually not something anyone's ever asked me before.
Yeah.
And interestingly, it's not something I tend to think of in terms of cars. I notice it with mobile phones. You know, you buy an iPhone and it dies 3 weeks after the warranty is run out, or almost guaranteed. Something will go wrong with it. But you know, different companies do have different attitudes to all this. If you look at Volvo and Saab back in the day, particularly, they had a longer design life than other companies did. You know, Volvos used to be designed to last 20 years at a time when most cars were designed to last 8. Which is also something I find interesting about classic cars, because actually, you know, the Lotuses that I'm interested in and that you're interested in probably were designed closer to the bone than other cars of the same era, and yet they survive. And the Mark I Ford Fiestas and the Hillman Hunters and such at the same time. You know, there's probably more Lotus XLs on the road now than there are Hillman Hunters. We make them last because we care about them.
They were designed with a race mentality. They were designed by people who built racing cars, and so they were.
I'm sure, I can't remember the exact wording, but one of Colin Chapman's mantras was that the perfect racing car is one that falls apart as it crosses the line in first place. Any component that lasts longer than beyond the checkered flag has been over-designed. It could be lighter. It could be, you know, it could be made more optimal. But the Lotus road cars always were intended to, you know, they're designed as road cars. They're not designed to quite that limit that the race cars are, but they're being designed by the same people who are going to have the same sort of attitude.
The title of what you do, what is that?
I am an analyst. I'm a design analyst.
But it's like finite.
A finite element analysis. The fundamentals behind that are you take a complex shape and you break it down into thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of tiny little bricks. You know, it's almost like you're reducing it to a Lego model of the component, because a square brick or even a pyramid-shaped brick, there are simple mathematical models for how that will behave. So if you can extrapolate that to an entire component made out of tiny little pyramids, then you can work out how that model will behave. All of this stuff is done by some very clever mathematicians who worked out the original theory and then built that into clever software, and I'm the monkey who drives the software.
What did you work at in Lotus?
In Lotus, I mostly worked on their consultancy stuff. Worked on the General Motors global engine that they were developing in the late 80s. I very briefly worked on the 918, which is the V8 engine that went into the last of the Esprits. I can claim a small amount of credit for the exhaust cam profile on that, that's really the extent of my involvement in that engine. And I think these days it's probably legitimate enough to say I worked on a very interesting prototype 3-cylinder engine for a client I probably shouldn't mention, but it was that was great because we went from a blank sheet of paper to a running prototype on the test bed in the space of about 9 months, on a very small team. There's probably less than a dozen of us working on this project. And we finally got it started. I actually remember it was probably a week or two before Christmas. And I stuck it on the test bed and said, okay, today's going to be the first startup, we're going to get this running. And it got later and later in the day, and it was like 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and we weren't quite ready, but none of us wanted to go home because we wanted to get it done that day. Eventually we tried to get the thing started, and it just simply wouldn't fire. And at some point somebody realized that the turbocharger, was it a turbo or no, I think it was a supercharger we got on this, was plumbed the wrong way round, and it was actually sucking air out of the engine rather than blowing into it. And as soon as we got that switched the other way round, the thing fired up a treat, and that, you know, champagne was out and we were all cheering.
No wonder you're not mentioning who you were making, who you were working for.
It was a proof of concept really, rather than something that was ever going to be developed into a full running engine, but they needed to know that something like this would work for them. That was entirely because the guy who should have been in charge was on holiday for a week, and they needed an urgent answer, and I simply filled in with him. It was never my job to work on the exhaust cam profiles. I just grabbed the opportunity while the other guy was away.
It worked out.
Yeah, so at least, which I'm really pleased with, because it did mean that I got my little bit of content into a Lotus engine, and otherwise after 2.5 years I would have actually never had anything I worked on that actually made it into a Lotus product. So at least I got my little moment in there.
I love this engine that many people love.
Absolutely, yeah. It was a shame, that engine, because actually I think the entire intention when they were developing it was that this wouldn't just go into the Esprit. I mean, it was in the Esprit for 4 years or so, I can't remember exactly, but it wasn't in there for a long time. The hope was that this was going to become a generic engine that customers would buy and stick into their cars. This was at a time when the Rover V8, which was kind of the default go-to engine for any small manufacturer, was obviously coming to the end of its life, and I think Lotus was kind of hoping to fill that gap. And they produced an engine that was very compact, it was lightweight, it was adaptable. It was, what they designed was a V8, but it could have easily been stretched to a V12, shrunk down to a V6. It was designed in a very modular way so that it could fit other companies' demands, and I think that was kind of the economic basis on which they justified its development, and it never happened. The interesting thing about it was, though, that all the design for that was done very old school. It wasn't actually done on, paper and pencil and stuff, but it was done using a 2D CAD system, because that was the cheap CAD system. And we had the 3D CAD system there at Lotus because we were using it for all the consultancy stuff we did. But apparently that was too expensive and to use for Lotus's own engine, so that was done using the much more old school 2D CAD system. When all this project started, when I joined the company, Lotus was owned by Romano Artioli, an Italian businessman who also owned Bugatti at the time. Bugatti went bust, he ran out of money and ended up having to sell Lotus, and they were sold to Proton. And I was there during the handover, so I was there both during the Artioli era and during the Proton era.
Tell me about your XL engine. What's just been going on with it?
I have spent the best part of the last year rebuilding it in my kitchen. Put the compression tester on it, and sure enough, the compressions on the 3 cylinders are like 180, 180, 25, 180. That's not good. So then got a bore scope and had a poke round inside. Now the later 900 series engines used the engines have a separate cylinder liner. The early ones were cast iron, the later ones were aluminium to go with the rest of the aluminium engine, and they were coated with Nichols, the special coating. And it's, people say that these liners tend to wear out. The coating wears out after between 80 and 100,000 miles. Mine had done 175,000 miles, so it had done twice the expected lifespan of this. So I thought, well, it's fair enough. I can't complain if it's done that many miles without a rebuild. So it was a really good experience because I've been working on engine design on and off for a lot of my professional life, but I've never actually got to take one apart and put it back together myself. And I was like, this is what I work on all the time, but I'm just working on the computers. You know, I should be able to do this right. And I've come up against various problems, but it's all simple mechanics. It's all basic things that go up and down and round and round, and with a bit of background knowledge and a bit of intelligence, it all makes sense. So yeah, I just stripped it down, replaced all the worn out bits, got the liners recoated with a fresh coating of Nichols. Had an absolute nightmare with the main bearings, trying to track the right ones down, and got it all back together again. And it went back, today is Thursday evening, and yeah, went back into the car on Sunday, 4 days ago. And tomorrow it's the classic motor show at the NEC. So today I trailered the car over to the NEC, and it's going to be on the stand for the Lotus XL Elite Eclat Club. Unfortunately, the engine still isn't running. There's some issue which I'm almost certain is an electrical issue and may well be related to the slightly dubious aftermarket security system that somebody saw fit to install.
Have you got the bug now? What's next?
Well, I've always been someone who's wanted to drive my cars. I've had in the past, I've had 2 MGB GTs, Triumph Spitfire, and now the Lotus, and they've always been daily drivers. I drive them to work, I drive them to the supermarket, I take the kids to school in them. That's what they've been for. And this is the first time I've had any car I've owned off the road for any length of time. So the aim is, the engine's running, it's back in the car, I'm just going to drive it.
Any relation to Ryan?
Sadly not, although having the first initial, I've had moments I've gone in for meetings with people and said, oh, I was hoping to meet Ryan Gosling, but no.
The monkey who drives the software. Well, self-deprecating as Richard is, he's a charming monkey, and he'll be back because I have another interview, or another half of an interview in the can with him about all the Land Rover stuff. So stay tuned for that. I'm looking forward to it. Now, to my patrons: Alberto Della Regina, Connor O'Connor, Jason Noyles, James McGregor, Jim Freeman, Jonathan Donoghue, Jonathan Nicholson, John Taylor, Mike Nolan, Rob Fitzpatrick, Stefan Reitersson, Tom Hodson and Tom Leonard are all people who have lent their support in the last couple of weeks. And guys, it felt like a boost. It feels like it's on the up again. In general, I'm talking about the series. So thank you. I can't thank you enough. I know that some of those guys came from the South East Lotus Owners Club, a forum and a club online based in the UK, but a great place for information, where I went researching some stuff and just got such a warm welcome. I'm a terrible lurker because I don't really have time, but I really wanted to say thanks to those guys. If you have a Lotus, you should check out lotusxl.net, the South East Lotus Owners Club, the Lotus forums, and any other forum. Forums are a brilliant place to get information about your car. Even if you do lurk, look, the information is there, and at some point I can almost guarantee you'll end up talking to people and having horizons expanded. So that is it. I just want to say, I don't know what happened. Episode 17, was it just a good one? Was it because I asked? Was it because Ian was such a nice guy? The response was just fantastic, and I'd love to try and keep it at that level. Please please subscribe and share, and I'm there in the comments. If you want to have a chat for whatever good it'll do you, I'm there to pow out, so give me a shout if you have something on your mind. All right, stay stuck in until next time, and until next time, good luck.
Bring out the gimp. I think the gimp's sleeping.